The Clashing Worlds and Their Influence in Shaping the Future of Humanity by Jacob Mahlangu. The historical account of the following argument dates around the creation of the idea of the nation-state in the majority of Western countries as a result of the Peace of Westphalia, Treaty of the year 1648, which was enacted as a doctrine to end the then existing wars. The treaty was also intended to be used as an ultimatum that replaces the feudal system that was in application and which was also practiced before the introduction of this treaty. Although having specifically dated and located the time frame of the general narrative that covers the subject matter, the occurrence of the concepts in usage throughout the text to illustrate and demonstrate the author's viewpoints are complemented by a provision of their brief description and history that predates the aforementioned era. This is so that there is no exaggeration and assumption that the reader is familiar with every term in usage by the author within the text. The generalization used in describing certain phenomena is essential in alerting the reader of the limitations of the author's examination of the subject at hand. It also highlights the decisions of the author in determining what was worth including and what was not. It does not, however, in any way mean that the author has limited information about the subject matter, but rather seeks to point out the fact that the text is rooted and focused on philosophizing and on widening the basic understanding of the subject matter by attempting to expand and increase a popular interest that enables even the most laziest readers to be involved in an intellectual engagement regarding the material, while the awareness and consciousness of the typical consumer of knowledge in this product stays intact and not detached like most sober-minded and rigid works that are systematic and formal in their nature. These works being referred to are the previous publications that I have covered the subject matter already. Such stringent rules in the academic world disturb the rhythm of an author's argument, and general readers receive no sentimental emotions from consuming such a product. This limits the impact and influence of the author in instilling a certain movement and direction as a result of his work, and grounds the author's familiarity existence to only those certain few who are patient enough to decipher the art and not only the science of the text. Such a target market can only exist among the academic peers of that author, resulting in the isolation of intellectual debates due to them having shifted a certain area that acts as a barrier between the formally educated and those simply interested in free thought. The efforts of the author are then wasted as the product fails to commercialize. For advanced experts and scholars in the discipline that has to do with this subject matter, the following work may be perceived as rudimentary and unsubstantiated. The author of this work acknowledges such a perception, as the intention of this work is not to factually justify any proposed hypothesis, but to rather broaden and reshape the thinking and perception of how an ordinary person views the global era. This then means that even the critique of the work is a sign of its success and of its intended impact and effect. By no means is this a piece of work that subjects its flexibility, intellectual grounding, and peripheral exploration to a rigorous, scientifically strict methodology that serves to classify it in a certain established field of study in an official learning institution. The author believes that every human being, except of course in the cases of serious impairment due to biological defects, has the ability to engage intellectually and contribute to progressive thinking that shapes the reality of the world and the interactions of the individuals within that world, despite the level of that individual's officially acquired qualifications or formal education. Lived experiences teach all of us a moral lesson and further shape our conduct as constantly evolving human beings with the ability to think, which separates and distinguishes human beings from other living organisms such as beasts and animals that we share the earth with. The promotion of free thought in the world elevates the progress of human civilization and also helps in fundamentally shaping its destiny in a direction which advantages everyone instead of a select few. The introduction of a curriculum in a learning institution determines the relevance of what matters and what topics should be focused upon. Such agenda-setting tactics limit an individual's creativity as thinking out of the box becomes rare, and the culture of obeisance to the offered knowledge by academic scholars, lecturers, archivers, publishers, and esteemed trusted experts distort those areas avoided by the scholarship offered. The process of theorizing in an academic institution is plagued by guidelines, regulations, ethics, and codes of conduct that limit the scope of spontaneous knowledge creation, as the individual is trapped in a rigid system that compels him to base his intellectual expansion on the previous work of others. There also exists the question of who sets the agenda and for what purpose, as the prominent intellectual thinker Robert Cox famously asserted that theory is always created by someone and for someone with an intention of accomplishing a certain purpose. The flexibility of thinking and the freedom to explore various aspects of a situation which assist an intellectual person in being diverse is constrained by the limitations of the scientific rules found in almost every learning institution. However, this proposed argument is simply intended to demonstrate the choice of the author's strategy in going about exploring the topic at hand. It is not an argument aimed at demeaning the institutions of learning, but is instead aimed at those demotivated people who lack the hunger for knowledge and are demotivated when it comes to engaging in an intellectual debate because they suffer from being academically irrelevant and therefore undermine the importance of their own opinion as it is not an educated one. For a societal transformation to occur, this discrepancy, which excludes other people while privileging the opinions of others, needs to be first exposed so that it can be remedied in the near future. As already mentioned earlier, the interaction of differing and sparsely fragmented territories through the traveling and explorations of the rest of the non-Western world by Western settlers has been the product of the Westphalian doctrine, which introduced the idea of the nation-state and principles which were associated with it, and were soon to shape the political system of the Western world to implement and support the ideology and the value of democracy. The structuring of Western societies based on this doctrine exacerbated the eagerness of these societies to expand to the rest of the world and apply their Western principles as norm entrepreneurs in societies that were undergoing their own process of civilization. The process and independent future determination of the civilizations of the colonized territories were interrupted by Western invasion, which replaced the indigenous knowledge of the natives, replaced their culture, history, their functioning as a society, and altered the direction of their destiny. In other areas of the world, such an attempt was rejected and fought against it successfully, such as in countries like China during the Ottoman Empire, together with certain Asian countries in the Arab world, while in others such an attempt was successful but inhumane and brutal, such as in African countries and certain Latin American countries. That period in the human history was labeled as the Colonial Era. In order for one to describe the current state of events and the direction at which the world is headed, there is a need for revisiting the colonial period, as it allows one to examine the nature and purpose of different actors who engage with each other in the current international political system. Revisiting this period arms one with the ability to diagnose the attitudes of states in relation to one another, and also helps the individual in determining how different countries perceive each other, how they choose to interact with each other, and through an analysis of the relationship of countries, one becomes capable to theorize about the likelihood of how the future of the global order might look like. The world continues to move in the Western direction through the use of soft power and also through other alternatives that can be perceived as drastic, such as force, the threat of the usage of weapons of mass destruction to any resisting country that refuses to follow internationally established rules, and also violence through military intervention. The global order of the 21st century is populated with principles, rules, values, ideologies, systems, and laws that are geographically proposed and are predisposed from the center, where they have emanated from. International organizations that are considered to be intergovernmental in their nature, designed with the formal purpose of promoting and preserving peace, order, trade relations, democracy, and unity among countries, have by far been dominated by those countries that have been historically victorious through the wars fought over power and domination. The complexity of the modern era is exacerbated by unidimensional ideas that determine who prospers and who suffers. Postmodern, post-colonial, and other thinkers who critique the mainstream ideas that dictate relations on the international level with the aim of introducing pluralism as an alternative in the current international order, such as Acharya, Baba, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Buzan, to name a few, are common intellectuals in the evolving field of international affairs who popularized the injustice of the continuing treatment of ideas from the periphery periphery, third world, with less regard by powerful actors. Other influential thinkers to the formulation of the post-colonial critique, such as Frantz Fanon, highlight the psychological after-effects of the colonized individual. The impact of the Western idea of modernity, according to Fanon, has transformed the perception of the slave and the colonized towards the colonizer through depicting the race of the colonizer as superior. What followed from such a mentality, according to Fanon, was the adoption of Western values, culture, language, and etiquette by the colonized while abandoning their own. Therefore, the colonized acknowledged their supposed primitive nature, which was instilled in their mindset by the colonizer, and the goals of the colonized were reshaped as they dismissed their unique involvement in civilization as a race and adopted Western principles with the intention of attaining modernity, reaching the status of importance of their colonial master and gaining his approval. Although the colonial era has disappeared from the world, its practices are still very much noticed in the current era. For instance, during the colonial times, the colonizers justified their brutality towards the natives of the territories they conquered by using their epistemology, science, and knowledge acquired and predisposed from their understanding of the world. The Western civilization that was evolved and advancing in its own determination of its future prospects and goals perceived itself as possessing the universal truth and objectivity regarding the perception of reality. Such a mentality, which was accompanied by the utilization of the Western knowledge production and scientific objectivity, has been the cause of undermining other civilizations, their progress, their ways of life, their future growth potential, by suggesting that the civilization of a certain population is reached through stages and phases. This line of thought is quite common in Edward Said's work regarding the Orientalism. The mentality that was embedded in the colonizers' minds was based on a superiority complex. Such a complex instilled the idea of competition among different races and therefore justified the colonizers' interpretation of the livelihoods of the natives found in the lands, which were soon to be taken over by the expansion of Western countries in their quest to Europeanize the whole world, while ensuring that power is maintained in the centers of operation, in this case, these centers being the empires and countries of the West. Colonizers based their intellectual and social interactions with the natives on a level that highlighted the dehumanization of the lives discovered from the foreign land, which ultimately specified the ranks of importance in the social classification of those different people. Colonizers perceived their social status in comparison with the natives as being more evolved, more intelligent, modern, civilized, educated, and therefore legalizing their actions of compelling those subspecies they considered to be less human than they are, to engage in activities that they would have rather not agreed to, have they been given a choice. These activities were detrimental to the status quo of the natives, and they were intended to restructure their societies in a way that benefits the colonizers, while at the same time promoting suffering among the original inhabitants of the invaded land. Western knowledge was then used to justify and pacify the inhumane treatment of the natives, such as Darwin's theory of evolution. This theory was manipulated to support the actions of the colonizers, such as how it was interpreted in the context, space, and time of its usage in the environment that it was applied to. The theory was used to applaud, sanctify, promote, and hold the Western proposed methods of existence in high regard, by being the basic tool of demonstrating scientifically the first progression of the evolution of the European white race, which assumed, accepted, and practiced the Darwinian position to describe their power and their right to possess ill-gotten land, stripping it from its original owners that were assumed to be incapable of running it efficiently in the measurability of economic potential growth. Such a measurement presupposed the intentions of the natives in regards to their own plan of their own land. The measurement was based on objectivity about human existence, sustenance, and progression, or evolution, and such a tool of measurement was developed, refined, and enhanced in the colonizer's home country, where it first emerged. The measurement in its home country was designed and implemented there from its earlier experiments that were conducted as an attempt to solve a domestic societal problem. In such an era, when comparing the standards of living between the colonizers and the natives before the invasion that caused these civilizations to clash because of their misunderstandings of how societies function, one can come to an obvious realization that for the natives to survive, live, and prosper in their own environment, they arguably may have had their own methods and strategies that maintained, sustained, and promoted their perpetual existence, and at the same time shaping the structure of their own societies and their progression. The belief that was held by the colonizer regarding the independence of a functioning society in a non-Western area or territory was that of judging and condemning other non-Western ways of living that the discovered societies were practicing, and the culture of the natives was believed to be barbaric and uncivilized, while at the same time considering the Western culture as a remedy and antidote for the colonized. The contradiction, of course, when analyzing the general idea of colonialism in order to ground and capture differing colonial events that have specific narratives, experiences, and results, is that through the practice of subordinating original inhabitants of a territory, the Western world was going against its own narrative of enlightenment, morality, and humanitarianism. Those values which were created by the West and were considered to be intrinsic, normative, philosophical, and applicable as instruments and tools most effective in designing a peaceful way of living among different people and their circumstances, were the basic roots of intellectualism and were therefore in line with the Western ideology and scientific justification of human evolution, which it described as modernism. Apart from competing Western ideologies that presented themselves in academic scholarship and learning institutions, the most agreed upon principles and values such as individualism were the ones that became pragmatic, popular, and were further considered to be the most evolved, among other alternatives emerging and existing within the colonizer's own country. By shifting the focus from the colonizers who strictly practiced monarchy during their engagement in the colonial era, while pointing out their awareness and acceptance of the same enlightenment that brought about the emergence of principles that were considered on and were surrounded by the idea of the importance of the individual. I then shift the focus to the home countries of those colonizers who were already at the stage of practicing democracy in its infant stage, such as during the transition period, which in most countries occurred by first hybridizing their then existing cultural systems of rule with democratic principles and practices, as the democratic system was the practical method of implementing the philosophies and values created from the Age of Enlightenment. Through such a simple methodological progress rooted in creative ground theory, the narration of the author is allowed the flexibility of examining and explaining the topic at hand by efficiently utilizing factors that the author finds suitable in his own capacity, personal predisposition, and experience with the topic to demonstrate the line of his argument. Through analyzing the general colonial theory and also classifying the significant details that can be utilized in describing, expanding, and defining the roots of its destructive nature, one is able to indulge in the subject matter with a motivated effort. Such a proposed method of analyzing the complex phenomenon of prevailing realities that follow the pattern of relations based on a hierarchical structure of power in the current global order allows a researcher, scholar, intellectual thinker, and author to dominate direction of his methodology without falling at its mercy. Through comparing how the Western world dealt with its rebellious citizens who rejected the status quo of the early democratic era that was at the time considered to be possessing objective truths at the core of its creation by leaders and high-profile intellectuals, with how the Western colonizers treated the rebellion of the natives, can point out clearly the dynamics and complexities that still exist and continue to be debated in the platforms that are used to structure the international global order in a certain direction that is favorable to some countries and unfavorable to others. Democracy, as both a practice and ideology, also saw the individual's engagement in determining their own destiny under the conditions of living amongst a society that had various aspirations and goals which would sometimes conflict with each other. When such occurs, the determinant of what eventually prevails from competing factions and groups of people who live in the same society but proposing and aiming for conflicting goals, the arbitration of the majority rule what the majority of the people desire as opposed to the minority that wants something else and different. Such a value, of course, undermines those whose ideas are rejected as they develop a sense of isolation and marginalization and also feel as if their voices are not heard. The treatment of the Western people who felt marginalized was different as opposed to the treatment of the natives by the same agent. This could be because although competing ideas existed within the Western world and the Western society aimed at differing and contradictory goals, where the ultimate decision landed on a majority of the people who were considered to want the same thing within the geographical boundaries of the Western world, the losers of the ideological battle based on how to best manage the existence of a peaceful and prospering society were not necessarily compelled to subjugate themselves to the winning ideology, but were instead given the freedom to continue supporting their ideas. Their ideas were represented in the deliberations of decisions that their government made for the betterment of society. This, of course, examined in a general sense, which by no means specifically attaches itself to any particular instance, but evaluates the common knowledge and experience a person gains from immersing themselves with historical documents that account for the history that has shaped the current situation, status, and relations of the states in the 21st century. The minority of the population that opposed the structuring of its own society in the days of colonialism, where the practice of democracy was still in its developmental experimental stage in terms of its applicability to society in the Western world, were not punished, still treated, enslaved as it were, with the natives who reacted almost the same way as the opposing minority of a Western country. At this stage of the narration, it is imperative for the author to point out the existing difference between the application of democratic principles in the Western world and the history of the concept of democracy and its ancient founders. Just because its practice came at a later stage in most Western countries does not mean that the ideology of democracy is as young and fresh as its practice. Here it is important to then further historicize the development of the democratic value, theory, and principle within politics. Such an assessment, even when briefly and simply revisited and pondered upon, will clarify the reasons behind its desirability and attractiveness as perceived by the Western world. This book is written in a way that does not follow the sequential systematic ordering of argumentation, but instead randomly places significant and suitable details at any point of the text, allowing the author to conveniently expand his argument through filling knowledge gaps between the supposed reader and the author himself. For it would be a grave mistake to conjure up concepts and indulge in a terminological interrogation about a certain phenomenon while assuming the reader's historical familiarity with the topic under interrogation. It is crucial for every author to control and command the tools, variables, instruments, and methods that the author uses so as to limit the constraints posed by the strict laws of academic and scientific writing. This, of course, is mostly suitable for the type of work intended for the general public, with no intentions to contribute to a certain field, but carrying the mere intention of being digested for the purposes of intellectual stimulation. The idea of democracy prevailed as an ideology that accompanied the establishment of the political discourse from its basic original roots in ancient Greece by thinkers such as Aristotle and Plato. Other possible and classical thinkers such as Thucydides, who has written the historical account of the Peloponnesian Wars, shaped the ontology used to perceive political interstate relations based on the ideology of realism, whose aspects aimed at assuming that competition, self-interestedness, and domination through power and violence are rooted in the inherent conditions of human nature. For instance, in the modern language of explaining what politics is and what it means, the space and time continuum that symbolize the evolution and the growth of the concept within its respectable context does not widely differ to how it was described, defined, and explained in its earlier stage of ideological development. Of course, the progression of the times have widened the scope of exploration, further expanding the ideology and reconfiguring it proactively so that the concept does not become obsolete, but instead adapts to the changing times. The general definition of politics is the activity of making collective decisions for the betterment of the society. The reason behind the necessity of making such decisions is based on the idea of limited resources within a society and also the prevalent disagreements among civilians, which end in violence, disorder, and chaos. There are, of course, multiple and various reasons that inspired the introduction of the idea of politics, but I merely highlight the two which I consider to be the most important in understanding the creation of the ideology of democracy to accompany the concept of politics. The complications that were highlighted by Greek philosophers in moralizing the concept of politics reside also in how it is defined. For instance, the politics concept highlights collective decisions, but it does not specify by whom or by which group in the society should engage in the deliberation of those decisions. The scope and size of how many people should engage in this deliberation process and how they were to be selected from the general population was a mystery when examining the politics concept in isolation. This predicament then opened an area of theorizing for ways to make the politics concept function properly. The idea of democracy was then introduced as an ideology used as a method and tool to operationalize the concept of politics. The very term of democracy was derived from a Greek word, demos, kratos, which in its definition between its language tenets of Greek and also the English language of the Western world does not differ at all. Democracy is simply defined as the rule by the people. Such a simple and short definition does not, of course, reflect its application, neither is it practice considered to be simplistic. The first challenge posed to the concept is how and where are people going to be engaging in collective decision-making, practice politics to determine how they live. Democracy's generic nature of simplicity as a concept underestimates the difficulty of its application. Upon the realization of its complicatedness in application, the concept of democracy was further intellectually investigated and reshaped throughout history. Another problem with applying the concept of democracy based on its simplistic definition of the rule by the people was the question of the doubled possibility of an existing suitable arena big enough to accommodate the whole population and also how differing ideas by the people were going to be handled in the deliberation process. The issue issue of time can also be noted in the process of decision-making that includes everyone in the society. The slow process of coming to agreeable decisions was going to be time-consuming and less effective. These problems associated with the concept of democracy were then addressed by thinkers who further contributed to the evolving changes of the concept, such as the idea of public officials and political representation through electing leaders to make decisions on behalf of the society, compensating them through material and monetary incentives while the rest of the citizens went about their private lives. The concept of democracy further got separated into different branches that differ in their operation within countries of the contemporary world. The resistance by the natives regarding the introduction of Western ontology, epistemology, objective truth, and universalism in their domestic dialogue was intolerable, according to the colonizer, as the colonizer assumed to know what's best for the native. Acting on the behalf of the natives and choosing how the pupil is to live was perceived as a justified action, and no known legal repercussions prevailed to hold the colonizer accountable for his abusive actions towards other people. The minority that opposed the existence of the dominating ideology while residing in the West before the prevalence of the colonial era and its expansion were of course the same race as the ones considered to be the majority in terms of choosing the ideas to be applied in that specific territory. Minority in a democratized country located in the West were given the autonomy and freedom to practice and promote their own ideas through representation in political debates. The minority's ideas that influenced their lifestyles and choices, further shaping their goals in the direction of how they envisioned their desirable way of living, were never trampled upon and disposed of as being primitive, as was the case with the natives who lived in the land that was facing a Western invasion. The incentive to those who define opinion symbolizes the good-natured behavior of rational thinking, proving the capability of the human race in living peacefully amongst one another, however different our goals are. The desires of the minority in the Western world in terms of their self-determined progression were respected and applied through hybridizing the dominating ideology to complement and accommodate the position by coexisting with it. Of course, these undermined ideas and theories that did not take center stage as of yet, but eventually did further down the line in the era of colonization, were also developed by Western thinkers. Although these ideas were challenging the status quo, their development was consistent and ripening towards fruition as they were climbing up the ladder and gaining acceptance from the switching majority that later supported them. Those ideas were not completely condemned and replaced. Neither were they silenced in order to propagate and shadow the enlightenment and intellectual growth of the masses with an ideology that shaped the operation of the then existing system. Instead, they evolved and were later taking effect through their established practices in a particular time in history due to the fallacy of a boastful claim of the West about its expertise, knowledge, and intelligence that increased its determination to expand its operations to the outside world and in the process universalized their proclaimed objective way of living that was ironically criticized within their own domestic territory. The Western confidence in their belief that they were more advanced as humans than the rest of the world accelerated their efforts of imposing their objectivity either through a peaceful submission of the natives to the Western way of living and also through coercion, violence, and torture of the resisting groups. The West powerfully and condescendingly demonstrated its supposed successful and effective methods, ideas, principles, and strategies as having been created by the evolved, intellectually superior and capable race responsible for organizing society using scientific endeavors of theorizing and experimenting. The reason for comparing the resistance of the Western population with the resistance of the natives will now be explored. The differing atmosphere of these different environments, of course, shapes their obviously noticed outcome of a differing nature. However, what one should also not leave out of such an examination is the controlled and manipulated situations of these different environments by the powerful actors involved in their processes. The comparison then will be taking intervening variables into consideration in order to be careful in its analysis. The comparison then first explains the Western situation, such as how it faced the separation between those who disagreed and those who agreed on the already established and practiced ideas, while the opposing groups were of the same race. For in such an era, people of the same race were to be located in the same territory, and there existed no multiculturalism within separated societies, especially on the basis of race. The dominant ideas practiced by the West, despite being critiqued at the domestic level in the Western world, served in arming it with the necessary strength and impact in being the driving force that aims to progressively create the best possible world where everyone is satisfied, constantly evolving and modernizing through Western-produced ideas. The reason for comparing such a domestic Western circumstance and the reactions of the powerful actors of the West in the colonizer's own country towards the opposing masses compared with the resistance of the natives living in the territory that the colonizer seeks to acquire and control, it is to outline the hypocrisy and cruelty of the past perpetrators responsible for the occurrence and experience of the colonial era that dominates the historical discourse purpose and its records. The Age of Enlightenment in the Western world introduced the consciousness that functioned to foster a more humane perspective of treating and determining the value of life. This was the moment of intellectual growth in that geographic area at the time. The logic used by the colonizer from the West in its quest to subjugate the people found in foreign territories produces a discrepancy and error in the basic tenets of the core principles that the West was representing and promoting. Maybe such a cunning maneuver by the West was noticed by the West during the time these events took place, as the West was probably intellectually capable of recognizing its own folly. If that is considered to be the case, then the element of deception and illusory behavior can be attributed to the tools used by the colonizer to master manipulation. In the international relations and the political science discourse, there exists a wide scholarship portraying, illustrating, and explaining the complexity of finding the absolute truth when dealing with society in order to scientifically study the behavior of societies, their individual level, and their interactions among one another. The way we view the world and describe it can never be objective. It will always differ from person to person as our personal predispositions, backgrounds, societal standing, and other personal attributes, traits, and features of the observer influence the way we see the world and how we interpret it. This then alludes to the fact that the individual operates and functions within the world instead of outside of it, and this limits the extent to which the individual can absorb information or hypothesize about the science of human behavior in an objective manner. Human behavior is considered to be unpredictable. The social sciences in the modern era have expanded and matured the theorizing process within their different disciplines to appropriately and soberly demonstrate the grave error of applying the methods of the natural sciences and the physical sciences when dealing with societal interactions, structure, and order. There is no possible way of objectifying how society functions because society cannot be used as an apparatus to credibly, validly, and reliably produce scientific objectives and universally applicable laws that capture and address the issues of differing societies. The historical basis of the current epistemology has shown the evolution of scholars who have been acknowledging the difficulty of assessing and prescribing different societies with ideas generated from a different reality, a different society, and a different situation, because this is bound to cause chaos as these universalized ideas that have their own home of origin bring about a different outcome in the foreign ideas where the idea is new and applied. Post-colonial thinkers of the modern era propose self-reliance and the freedom of countries to exercise their own destiny through theorizing domestically, producing other epistemologies that could oppose the West but are concentrated, intended, and suitable to solve the problems faced by the society within the border that is responsible for implementing its own independent created ideas. The behavior of the colonizers towards the natives highlights a deliberate contradiction of some of the ideologies held in high regard by the colonizers in their home country. By scientifically manipulating its own created ontology regarding human evolution, the Western colonizer was unable to successfully rationalize the opposed differing importance and the value of life, which classified the natives of color below the importance and value of the white colonizer. Through this classification, the relationship of the colonizer and the native was then perceived by the colonizer as that which resembles a master-slave relationship. The hierarchy of power was then determined on a racial basis that favored the whites of the colonial times over the natives of color. This comparison does not mean that there exists unity within the same race, as I have demonstrated otherwise in my analysis of the Western democratic scenario and case. What this means is that no matter the existence of discrimination and differences in ideas and principles among the same race, the Western white race, upon their departure from their home countries, provided a united front, priding the advancement of their societies and the superiority of their race as opposed to other races, and seeking to expand their power to the rest of the world with the intention of subjugating other territories to serve their home country economically and for other purposes. The comparison does not take any consequential and collateral aspect and variable impacted as a result of such theorizing into account. The author isolates the comparison typology to focus on the main elements being examined. The dimensions left out from the comparison will be explored appropriately where they are suited in history, as the comparison seeks to demonstrate the domination of the world based on the aspect of racial classification. By simplifying such a model, a basic, logical, and pure illustration free of distortions is obtained. When one visits the colonial history through its literature and comes across the legitimization of ill-treating the natives, such as the evolution justification, one can erroneously assume that by labeling the colonizer as modernized and the natives as primitive, the motive of the colonizer was to modernize the native. Even if that were the case, such a motive is immoral within itself, but the colonizer's motive cannot be interpreted from his scientific justifications of evolution, as the actions of the colonizer towards the native contradicted that assumed purpose. The motive was not to intellectually emancipate and progress the evolution of the native, but rather to dehumanize the natives by classifying them as subspecies, which can be used for hard labor to the benefit of the colonizer, while the colonizer engaged himself in modern practices of intellectual growth, and at the same time burdening the native with physical torture. The colonial era, although having ended, is still shaping the global order of the 21st century, despite the measures introduced after the colonial era, which are embedded in the promotion of peace, unity, order, equality among diverse populations, the freedom of movement of individuals, a conducive environment for multicultural societies, and the respect for sovereign states from every territory, which are enforced and monitored by international organizations such as the United Nations. The remnants of colonialism are still prevalent in a sense that the colonial era enriched the previous colonizers, who now have prospering economies, a higher status and influence within international organizations, while the previously colonized are still suffering from the historical invasion of their land and are facing poverty and underdevelopment in the current era. These historical tensions of domination and coercion are influencing the current flow of ideas within international institutions created for the purpose of promoting principles that highlight the importance of humanity by coming with solutions, rules, doctrines, and charters that are cosmopolitan in nature to prevent and also end war, as differences among countries are deliberated upon within these international institutions. These institutions can then be safely assumed to be practicing politics on the international level. However, the previously colonized are not ignorant of the power relations within these institutions and their position in the hierarchy of the members of these institutions. They are also not gullible as to believe the rhetoric of fairness and equal treatment of ideas which these institutions claim to practice. The historical tensions of the past based on actions of domination are of course not limited only to the Western relationship with countries outside the Western geographical location, but also within the Western world itself. Difference between the relationship of the colonizer and the colonized, and also the relationship of the colonizer and the colonizer, is that the former was based on subjugation, while the latter was based on the race to domination. The countries of the Western world conflicted and fought with each other based on the motive to conquer non-Western territories, which landed them in fighting over which territory to take over. While the center and peripheral relationship had a negative impact on humanity as a result of brutal violence and subjugation of a certain group of people found in the territory soon to be colonized, the center against the center had a larger destructive impact and scale, which became popular through being termed as a world war. The destructive scale of the war between these fellow conquerors of territories was exacerbated by the fact that they were almost equally powerful and were in possession of weapons of mass destruction. This world war, considered as the first to occur, inspired the creation of the League of Nations as an attempt to remedy the situation and restore peace. However, its failure became prevalent upon the arrival of the Second World War, as the battle between the white races in the First World War was explained as the race to dominate and conquer territories. I introduced another dimension that caused tensions within the white race by focusing on Nazi Germany in the Second World War. The extermination of the Jews in Nazi Germany is obvious enough in pointing out how the white race of that time was divided among itself and differed in their belief system. And these divisions enabled the brutality inflicted on a white race by a white race. The first dimension focused upon during the analysis of the colonizer and the native highlighted the clash of differing worlds and civilizations based on knowledge, science, and racial classification, while the second dimension, illustrated through the First World War scenario, highlighted the fact that the unity of the same race when conquering other races was not enough to assume that there could never occur the same brutal action among the same race, and the dimension focused upon in that scenario was based on power and competition. The introduction of the Second World War not only complemented the pattern that has proven the possibility of the white race to fight among itself, but has pointed out that the genocide of the same race can occur within advanced societies that share the same color, such as the extermination of the Jews in Nazi Germany. The dimension focused upon in that case was based on religion. The clashing worlds throughout history have been undermining the value of life of the individual. Such produced devastating effects and unprecedented, unnecessary, and careless casualties that resulted in the loss of lives of a multitude of people in various geographic areas for many reasons. Whether the justification of those who were the perpetrators of violence in those areas in allowing such inhumane and barbaric acts of killing is valid enough for such an act to have been impossible to be avoided and was instead inevitable is another matter which requires an intellectual investigation. The imbalances of power among countries will further be explored in the following chapter. There are various spheres, dimensions, and sociological areas that make up the world, which are used to assess and observe the power play between countries of the 21st century, such as the economic, the political, the social, the technological, the military, and other various spheres existing within the functioning of the modern global society, which privilege powerful countries and devastate weaker ones. The negative results brought forth by the application of the theory of realism to govern the international system, which assumed states to be self-centered, power-seeking, possessing only the motive of domination and competition as their basis for engaging in the international system, and also viewing the functioning of the international system as a zero-sum game. The negative results of practicing this ideology were the wars that occurred. The ideology was operationalized in a manner which was similar to how thinkers like Thomas Hobbes explained human nature. In transitioning the international system from being war-oriented to being motivated by peace and respect for human lives, the antithesis of the ideology of realism, often referred to as idealism or liberalism, which portrayed the desired way of living instead of the accepted way of living, promoting the capability of good-naturedness, altruism, and selflessness as a proposal in how countries were to conduct themselves in the international system in order to restore peace, eliminate violence, and maintain order. The international organizations adopted the ideology of idealism through embedding its principles within the rules, laws, structures, and doctrines of those organizations. In the colonial times, the economic ideology that was held in high regard by the Western world was mercantilism, which focused on the power and wealth of the state. As the ideological development progressed and the attention was shifted from the importance of the state to the importance of the freedom of the individual, the economic paradigm was then transitioned and was conceived as empowering individuals and being economically flexible within their own capacity, which separated the control of the economy by the state to allow the free market ideology of economic liberalism to thrive. This wave of intellectualism was introduced by the classical economic thinker and founder such as Adam Smith in his publication of The Wealth of Nations, which promoted the principles that condemned the state's intervention in individuals' economic relations and activities through terms such as laissez-faire, meaning hands-off. This wave has shaped the 21st century in a manner that portrays different spheres of power, such as the economic and the political individuals as non-state actors but considered to be the holders of capital, and the owners of corporations were allowed to expand the operations of their corporations throughout the rest of the world, turning them into multinational entities. However, even with the division of power between the state and non-state actors, they still share the similarity of being from the West. The imbalances of power can both be witnessed on the domestic state level and also on the international level, as the capitalist ideology of the economic system created classifications within the society based on wealth, such as the rich and the poor, or the elite and the working class. This classification also demonstrated the relationship between the people of the higher class and those of the lower class, especially in the Industrial Revolution, whereas in order for the lower class to survive, it had to seek employment and labor from the higher class so as to be compensated with minimum wages. While the lower class toiled for their livelihoods through labor, their conditions were not improved as their wages were meager and were far from being justified as fair to the effort and energy they exerted through working for the higher class that was increasingly getting richer as a result of the efforts of the lower class. This problem was addressed by other classical thinkers who sought to provide a critique of the capitalist ideology in the economic system within the country, such as Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, which analyzed and highlighted the inhumane errors prevalent in the capitalist ideology. On the international level, the practice of the capitalistic ideology between countries also transformed the social dimension within the countries who adopted the ideology, and societies were reshaped in a similar manner of classism. The effects of such a social classification born from capitalism was witnessed geographically within the borders of a territory through the obvious restructuring of infrastructure, whereas those considered to be of the lower class were located and concentrated in the same area, rural in nature. Their area featured low standards of living, poor infrastructure, poor services, and the resemblance of poverty in general. On the other hand, the dwellings of the higher class were much more modernized, advanced, and urbanized. When analyzing the economic power of non-state actors in relation to state actors and their political power, one should not assume that non-state actors serve to replace the political discourse. The economic power is based on monetary value of profits. Non-state actors do not concern themselves with ruling, policing, or governing citizens, and when they influence these areas, it is usually for no other reasons other than to maximize their profits and increase their wealth. Such activities are left to the sovereign state. Although there is a coexistence between political power and economic power, their directions are not parallel. In fact, economic power can influence the conduct of political power. For instance, During the process of elections, which are to determine the political leaders of the country, there is a competition of pre-proposed policies introduced by competing candidates or political parties. These potential policies differ in ideology, and some policies conflict with and challenge the capitalist ideology for more social justice and equality. Such policies are referred to as the left wing, which constantly fights and vouches for the representation and redress of the marginalized and the economically excluded population. Such policies threaten the future of the capitalist elite, and by reorganizing the likely outcome of the devastating effect which might result from such policies, the capitalist elite strategize their influence during the election process by funding the campaigns of those candidates who are pro-capitalist in their policy proposals. Due to the power of the media and marketing, the public's attention is bombarded with the presence of pro-capitalistic proposals, while anti-capitalistic proposals become less popular and unable to generate popular support due to the lack of resources of promoting and advertising their policies at the same level as the pro-capitalist proposals. The decision-making of the voter is distorted by the perceived reality without being aware of alternatives that exist, as they do not reach the attention of the population successfully due to the media being dominated by opposing funded candidates. The outcome of the elections end up ultimately in the favor of pro-capitalist policies, and this also points out how the capitalist elite undermines, distorts, and controls political outcomes through limiting and eliminating certain choices so that the political climate can shift in their favor. This is not the only benefit obtained by the capitalist in his manipulation of the political discourse. Due to the indebtedness of the elected leader, his funders, the leader is likely to operate in a manner that advantages the capitalist elite instead of the popular will. This can include the awarding of government projects to certain industries in the form of public-private partnerships, and also assist an industry in eliminating its competition on the market through subsidizing the cost of their production. And in terms of foreign competition, the government brought into power through the social manipulation of the capitalist elite can impose taxes on imported goods to make alternative competitive products more expensive and less desirable. Another benefit involves the government awarding a certain industry with patents that bar entrance of competitors in the industry, further transforming the industry responsible for the funding of the ruling previous candidate into a monopoly that determines its own prices, with limited choices faced by the consumer as a result. The concept of democracy is then merely just an illusion which claims to be the rule of the people, while it is merely a rule of the few. The commanders of the economy are in such a position due to the possession of previously ill-gotten wealth. The transitioning of states into democracies was accompanied by the promotion of the value of liberty, allowing the individual the necessary freedom of ownership of enterprises and property. This logic avoided the previous injustices which landed the ownership of wealth in the hands of the elite through appropriation by violent means. Instead of redressing and reappropriating this wealth to its rightful owners, such an attempt was regarded as reverse discrimination and was considered as conflicting with the current values of peace, as such an activity would not resemble progression but backwardness and a return to the past chaos, disorder, and war. Other pro-liberty thinkers of the right wing, such as Robert Nozick, rationalized the redundancy of past rectifications regarding the reallocation of wealth so as to justify the current status quo, which is constantly criticized by the left-wing thinkers. However, these rationalizations did not guarantee their acceptance as proven by revolutions which separated economic ideologies into two, between capitalism and communism, as both these economic ideologies existed with the purpose to transform the global economic order through expanding these ideologies to the rest of the world. Their differing applications created tensions between those who were advocating them. This then was after the Second World War, and the dimension of the conflict was based on ideological superiority. The era was referred to as the Cold War, which saw countries grouping themselves through alliances and divided due to ideological differences. The United States and its allies during that period were pro-capitalist, while its competition, Russia and the other members of the USSR, was also powerful but was pro-communist. Although this era did not end up in an all-out war, with the closest predicament of such a likelihood being the Cuban Missile Crisis, there existed an arms race between these countries and other means of competition, such as technological advancement. The likelihood of a war breaking out from those tensions was expected, although it likely did not. This, of course, only applies to the tensions experienced by centers of these conflicting ideologies against each other. It does not, however, account for those wars that broke out outside of the centers. For example, the civil wars, coups, genocides, mass murder, ethnic conflicts, and secession movements. that were taking place on the previously colonized countries after having obtained independence from Western oppression. These countries, especially those located in the African continent, were under chaos and disorder as the population inherited the already established colonial systems and administrations of governance, while their knowledge and experience was limited in maintaining the perpetual existence of the inherited order. The diminished history and indigenous knowledge of these countries landed them in the position of being path-dependent in their continuity through playing the catch-up game by following the footsteps of their previous colonizers. The fight to power caused violence within these countries, and the results of the colonial era continued to cause further destruction, as there was a displacement of individuals due to the colonially created artificial borders, and this caused different tribes within the same territory to fight amongst each other. The Cold War era did not help in preventing the chaos that was taking place in the newly independent countries of Africa. In fact, the disorder was used as a tool and instrument to gain support of African countries to favor the competing ideologies of socialism and capitalism. In order to obtain this support, the countries responsible for the Cold War provided the African countries with weapons and aid so as to turn them into allies of Russia or the United States. These African casualties can be used again to illustrate the default of basing the tools and fundamentals of power and domination only on racial classifications, as I have mentioned in the previous chapter about the war in the Western world between the same race. The same incident was occurring in the African continent regarding the black race. The advocates of communism gained their understanding of the concept from its intellectual thinkers and founders such as Marx, Lenin, Hegel, and others. The theories that shaped communist thinking were the dependence theory, world system theory, and classism. Although the communist ideology is often associated with Marx, the communist practice of the Cold War era differed from Marx's predictions and recommendations of how a communist country was to look like. For instance, Marx predicted that there would be a point in time where the proletariat working class gets weary of its unfavorable condition, and a revolution would occur where the proletariat will fight, dominate, and topple the bourgeoisie elites. After such an occurrence in restoring order, the intellectuals and technocrats will be responsible for the restructuring of society. The practice of communism in the Cold War era was not the product of technocrats and intellectuals, but rather of radical revolutions and their leaders such as Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro, and Mao. The fact that the communism is rooted in discriminating and pointing out the flaws of capitalism does not mean that as an antithesis it lacked its own flaws, as I will demonstrate. Using the application of communism in African countries during the early stages of their independence, the communist discrepancies will be clearly diagnosed and also probably add another perspective as a part of the account of its eventual failure. The first law of communism that can be explored is how capitalism was associated with a political system that favored democracy and the freedom of individuals, while communism's purpose was to diminish the class system and increase equality. The communist economic vision failed to separate itself from the political processes of the country. In fact, the politics of the country determined the economic prosperity of the country. To elaborate this a bit further, upon assuming office, the ruling government decided the country's resource distribution and allocation. It also decided what was to be produced and also by whom. By doing so, the communist rhetoric gunned down the capitalist notion of free choices and preferences for the consumers. In other words, it limited alternatives and formed monopolies with only a few companies allowed to produce certain products without any competition. By doing so, the communist government ideological practice interfered not only with how the economy operates, but also how political outcomes were to turn out. The country's economy was determined and centrally planned and controlled by the political leader who was in office at the time of the economic outlook resembling a communist vision. Therefore, most countries that were communist were far from being democratic. In fact, they were considered to be authoritarian. Those communist countries who claimed to be democratic only did so through shielding their autocratic nature in the guises of a democratic facade to maintain popular support and obedience, and also to limit the extent of rebellion from the constituency. The individual's flexibility in attaining economic wealth was impeded due to limited access in those aspects that could make such possible. The democratic facade included the support by the government of the free will for citizens to choose their political representation through joining other parties and also through engaging in free and fair elections. The political leader's term of office had to be acknowledged so as to keep the existing frequency of increasing public participation and the politically conscious citizenry. This facade was an illusion. For instance, although there was a term of office which allowed the occurrence of elections, The communist leaders recognized that they had to stay in power regardless of the citizens' choice of representation, and they therefore fixed and rigged elections so they could keep their power and maintain their positions in office. This amounted to leaders who stayed in office for decades despite the cries and dissatisfaction of the citizens with the leaders ruling. Other communist states did not hesitate in assassinating political competition in a sense that those candidates and political parties who were promoting anti-communist policies were killed and threatened to exile, while the general population that opposed the regime was considered to be treacherous and also faced dire consequences for their acts. Except other forms of rule such as by a junta, military rule, or those chaotic states that were labeled fragile or failed, the majority of those African countries that were at least stable enough to function, the regime type in those countries was considered as socialist